Thomas Hartwell wiped the sweat from his brow as he set down his worn carpenter's tools beside the rickety porch of the small wooden house on the outskirts of Redemption Creek, Arizona Territory. The year was 1887, and the desert sun beat down mercilessly on this forgotten corner of the American frontier. What had started as a simple job delivering lumber to the wealthy railroad baron Harrison Montgomery had taken an unexpected turn when Thomas spotted an elderly widow struggling to patch a gaping hole in her roof with nothing but old newspapers and prayer. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, had kind eyes that sparkled despite the hardship etched into every line of her weathered face. Her husband had died in a mining accident 6 months prior, leaving her with nothing but this crumbling house and a mountain of unpaid debts. Thomas knew he should have continued on to Montgomery's mansion on the hill, where a substantial payment awaited him for the premium oak planks loaded in his wagon. Instead, something deep in his conscience wouldn't allow him to pass by this woman's suffering. Without hesitation, Thomas unloaded half of Montgomery's expensive lumber and set to work repairing Mrs. Whitmore's roof, reinforcing her sagging front porch, and fixing the broken window shutters that had been hanging askew for months. He worked through the scorching afternoon and well into the evening, using his own nails and hardware, knowing full well that Montgomery was expecting those exact planks for his grand dining room renovation. Mrs. Whitmore tried to protest, insisting she had no money to pay him, but Thomas simply smiled and continued hammering away under the pale moonlight. As dawn broke over the purple mountains surrounding Redemption Creek, Thomas packed his remaining tools and prepared to face Montgomery's inevitable fury. He had used nearly half the lumber intended for his employer, and there was no way to explain it that wouldn't result in his immediate dismissal. The carpentry business was already scarce in this remote territory, and jobs like Montgomery's were rare treasures that could sustain a working man for months. Yet, as he looked back at Mrs. Whitmore's now sturdy home, with smoke rising cheerfully from her properly sealed chimney, Thomas felt no regret. The ride to Montgomery's estate took him through the heart of Redemption Creek, past the dusty main street where the general store, saloon, and sheriff's office stood like weathered sentinels against the endless sky. Cowboys and merchants were already beginning their daily routines, and Thomas nodded politely to those he recognized. The town had grown considerably since the railroad arrived 2 years earlier, bringing with it opportunities and conflicts that had transformed this once quiet settlement into a bustling frontier hub. Montgomery's mansion loomed ahead like a monument to wealth and ambition, its freshly painted white walls and manicured gardens standing in stark contrast to the rough adobe and wooden structures that comprised most of Redemption Creek. Harrison Montgomery had arrived from Boston 3 years prior with seemingly unlimited funds and grand plans to establish a railroad empire across the Southwest. He employed half the town in various capacities, from construction workers building his rail lines to domestic servants maintaining his opulent lifestyle. Thomas had been fortunate to secure steady work from Montgomery, but he knew the railroad baron's reputation for ruthlessness when it came to business dealings. As Thomas approached the servant's entrance with his significantly lighter wagon, he rehearsed various explanations in his mind, none of which seemed adequate. He could claim the lumber was damaged or stolen, but Montgomery was too shrewd to accept such obvious lies. He could tell the truth and hope for mercy, though Montgomery's previous reactions to employee shortcomings suggested this would be futile. The sun climbed higher as Thomas steeled himself for what would likely be his final conversation with his most important client. But what happened next would forever change not only Thomas's life, but also reveal secrets about Harrison Montgomery that would shake the very foundations of Redemption Creek society. The butler who answered the door wore an expression of unusual urgency, immediately escorting Thomas not to the service area where deliveries were typically handled, but directly to Montgomery's private study. The room was filled with expensive leather-bound books, detailed maps of railroad routes, and several framed photographs that Thomas had never noticed during his previous visits to the mansion. Montgomery stood with his back to the door, staring out the large window that overlooked the town below. His usually immaculate appearance seemed disheveled, and his normally commanding voice carried an unfamiliar tremor when he spoke without turning around. He asked Thomas about his activities the previous evening, specifically whether he had visited the old Whitmore place on Cottonwood Lane. Thomas's heart raced as he realized Montgomery somehow already knew about his diversion of the lumber. But he answered honestly, prepared to accept whatever consequences awaited him. To Thomas's complete astonishment, Montgomery slowly turned around with tears streaming down his face. The powerful railroad baron, feared throughout the territory for his iron will and merciless business tactics, stood before his employee in a state of emotional collapse. Montgomery's next words would reveal a connection to Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore that Thomas never could have imagined, and would explain why the wealthy businessman had been secretly monitoring the elderly widow's situation for months without ever approaching her directly. Eleanor Whitmore was Harrison Montgomery's mother. 40 years earlier, she had been Eleanor Montgomery, wife of a struggling homesteader named Samuel Montgomery in Kansas. When Harrison was 12 years old, Samuel had abandoned his family during a particularly harsh winter, taking what little money they had and disappearing forever. Eleanor, left destitute with a young son, had been forced to make an agonizing decision. She surrendered Harrison to a wealthy childless couple passing through town, believing this sacrifice would give her boy opportunities she could never provide. The couple promised to send letters and maintain contact, but once they departed for Boston, Eleanor never heard from her son again. Montgomery explained to Thomas how he had spent years searching for his mother after building his fortune in the East. He had hired private investigators and followed countless false leads across the frontier before finally locating Eleanor in Redemption Creek. However, shame and uncertainty had prevented him from revealing his identity. He feared she might reject him or, worse, that she might only accept him out of financial desperation rather than genuine love. Instead, he had quietly arranged for various anonymous forms of assistance, always ensuring they appeared to come from church charities or community organizations rather than from him personally. The railroad baron's plan had been to gradually improve Eleanor's circumstances until he found the courage to reveal himself. He had been monitoring her situation through trusted intermediaries, including Thomas himself, though the carpenter had been unaware of his role in Montgomery's elaborate scheme. When Montgomery learned that Thomas had spontaneously repaired Eleanor's house using company materials, he realized that fate had presented him with the perfect opportunity to finally reunite with his long-lost mother. Montgomery's emotional revelation continued as he described the guilt that had consumed him throughout his rise to wealth and power. Every success had been tainted by the knowledge that his mother might be suffering somewhere while he lived in luxury. He had built his railroad empire partly in hopes of creating a network that would eventually lead him back to her, and when he finally found her living in poverty just miles from his mansion, the irony had been almost unbearable. Thomas listened in stunned silence as Montgomery outlined his plan for the reunion. Rather than simply appearing at Eleanor's door and potentially shocking the elderly woman, Montgomery wanted Thomas to serve as an intermediary. The carpenter would return to Eleanor's house under the pretense of checking on his repair work, during which he would gradually introduce the possibility that she might have a son searching for her. Montgomery would then arrive as if by coincidence, allowing for a more natural recognition between mother and son. The complexity of Montgomery's emotions became even more apparent as he shared his fears about the reunion. He worried that 40 years of separation had changed them both too dramatically, that Eleanor might not even recognize the boy she had given up decades earlier. He feared she might view his wealth and status as evidence that her sacrifice had been unnecessary, or worse, that she might feel abandoned all over again when she learned he had been living nearby without contacting her. Montgomery's vulnerability in that moment revealed a side of the railroad baron that none of his employees or business associates had ever witnessed. The man who commanded respect through power and intimidation was actually driven by a profound longing for the maternal love he had lost as a child. His ruthless business practices and demanding perfectionism suddenly made sense as the behaviors of someone who had learned early in life that security and control were essential for survival. As Montgomery finished explaining the situation, he made an offer to Thomas that went far beyond simple employment. He proposed that Thomas become his personal representative in all matters relating to Eleanor's welfare, with a generous salary that would make the carpenter one of the wealthiest residents of Redemption Creek. More importantly, Montgomery asked Thomas to help him navigate the delicate process of rebuilding a relationship with his mother, recognizing that the carpenter's natural kindness and integrity made him the ideal person to facilitate this reunion. Thomas accepted Montgomery's proposal, understanding that he had become part of something much more significant than a simple business transaction. Over the following days, he made regular visits to Eleanor's house, ostensibly to ensure his repairs were holding up well. During these visits, he carefully introduced topics related to family, loss, and the possibility of unexpected reunions. Eleanor gradually opened up about her past, sharing stories about her young son and the heartbreak of giving him up for adoption. The emotional weight of Eleanor's memories became clear as she described the nights she had spent wondering about her son's fate, imagining what kind of man he might have become, and hoping that he would somehow find his way back to her. She had kept a small wooden toy train that had been his favorite possession, carrying it with her through decades of hardship as her only physical connection to the child she had lost. The significance of this detail was not lost on Thomas, given Montgomery's career in the railroad industry. Eleanor also revealed that she had never remarried after her husband's abandonment, despite several suitors over the years, because she had always held on to hope that her son might someday return and that she wanted to be findable if he came looking for her. This dedication to preserving the possibility of reunion had shaped every major decision in her life, from her choice to remain in the same general region to her insistence on keeping the name Montgomery even after her husband's disappearance. Meanwhile, Montgomery grew increasingly nervous as the planned reunion approached. He had Thomas purchase new clothes for Eleanor, again presenting them as gifts from the church ladies' auxiliary. He also had the carpenter deliver groceries and household supplies, ensuring his mother would be comfortable and well provided for when he finally revealed himself. Every detail was carefully orchestrated to create the best possible conditions for their first meeting in 4 decades. The reunion itself took place on a Sunday afternoon in late autumn, with golden light filtering through the cottonwood trees that gave Eleanor's street its name. Thomas had arranged for Montgomery to arrive while he was visiting Eleanor, making the encounter appear coincidental. When Montgomery knocked on the freshly repaired door of his mother's house, Thomas opened it and invited the well-dressed stranger to join them for coffee, as was customary in frontier hospitality. Eleanor looked up from her sewing as the tall, distinguished gentleman entered her modest living room, and something in his eyes immediately captured her attention. Montgomery removed his hat and spoke her name softly, and in that moment, despite the passage of 40 years and the dramatic changes that time had wrought in both of them, mother and son recognized each other instantly. The reunion was marked not by dramatic declarations, but by a quiet understanding that passed between them, followed by an embrace that seemed to heal decades of separation and longing. The aftermath of the reunion transformed both Eleanor's and Montgomery's lives in ways that neither had anticipated. Eleanor moved into a comfortable house that Montgomery purchased for her near his mansion, close enough for regular visits but far enough to maintain her independence and dignity. Montgomery discovered that his mother's wisdom and perspective provided exactly the guidance he had been missing in his business and personal life, while Eleanor found joy in finally knowing that her sacrifice had indeed given her son the opportunities she had hoped for. Thomas continued to serve as a bridge between mother and son during their adjustment period, helping them navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of rebuilding their relationship. His role evolved from simple carpentry work to that of trusted family friend, and Montgomery made good on his promise of financial security, establishing Thomas as his primary contractor for all railroad construction projects in the region. The story of the reunion gradually became known throughout Redemption Creek, though Montgomery requested that the details remain private to protect his mother's dignity and his own privacy. The community's perception of the railroad baron shifted as word spread about his devotion to his mother and his genuine care for her welfare. This humanization of Montgomery had positive effects on his relationships with employees and business associates, as people began to see him as more than just a ruthless capitalist. Eleanor's influence on her son's business practices became apparent over the following months, as Montgomery began implementing more worker-friendly policies and contributing more generously to community improvement projects. Her moral compass and frontier wisdom provided the ethical foundation that his business empire had previously lacked, and their partnership became a powerful force for positive change in Redemption Creek and the surrounding territory. Thomas's act of kindness toward an elderly widow had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately reunited a family and transformed an entire community. His willingness to sacrifice his own security to help someone in need, had revealed the profound truth that compassion and generosity often create ripple effects far beyond what we can imagine or intend. The months that followed brought changes to Redemption Creek that no one could have predicted when Thomas first spotted that rickety roof on Cottonwood Lane. Eleanor's gentle influence on her son's business dealings created a transformation that rippled through every aspect of life in the growing frontier town. Workers who had once feared Montgomery's harsh demands now found themselves earning fair wages with reasonable hours, and the railroad baron's contributions to the local school and church became legendary throughout Arizona Territory. Thomas watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction, understanding that his simple act of kindness had unlocked something far greater than anyone could have imagined. Montgomery had offered him a permanent position overseeing all construction projects for the railroad, with a salary that made him one of the most prosperous men in town. But more than the financial security, Thomas treasured his role as the bridge between mother and son, helping them navigate the delicate process of rebuilding 4 decades of lost time. Eleanor had insisted on keeping her small wooden toy train, the one memento from her son's childhood, displayed prominently in her new parlor. Montgomery would often sit beside it during their evening visits, marveling at how his mother had carried the symbol of their connection through decades of hardship and uncertainty. The sight of that weathered toy never failed to move him to tears, reminding him of the woman who had loved him enough to give him away and then spent 40 years hoping he would return. The relationship between mother and son deepened as they shared stories from their separate journeys. Eleanor spoke of the countless nights she had wondered about her boy's fate, while Montgomery described his relentless search across the Western Territories. They discovered that they had actually been within 50 miles of each other on several occasions during his quest, separated only by timing and circumstance. These near misses made their eventual reunion feel even more miraculous and precious. Thomas observed how Eleanor's presence softened Montgomery's edges without diminishing his business acumen. The railroad baron learned to listen more carefully to his workers' concerns, and his mother's frontier wisdom helped him navigate the complex relationships between settlers, ranchers, and tribal communities. Eleanor had lived through conflicts and cooperation with various groups during her years alone, and her insights proved invaluable in Montgomery's negotiations for railroad expansion rights. The community of Redemption Creek began to see Montgomery not as an outsider imposing his will on their territory, but as a man with genuine ties to the land and its people. Eleanor had become something of a local institution during her years of quiet struggle, respected for her dignity in the face of hardship and her willingness to help neighbors despite her own poverty. Her son's association with her created a bridge between his wealth and the common people's experiences. As winter approached, Montgomery decided to host a grand Thanksgiving celebration for the entire town, with Eleanor serving as the guest of honor. The event took place in the newly constructed community hall, which Montgomery had built with materials and labor donated by his railroad company. Thomas supervised the construction, ensuring that every detail met Eleanor's specifications for a space where all of Redemption Creek's residents would feel welcome. The Thanksgiving celebration became an annual tradition that drew people from settlements throughout the territory. Eleanor would tell stories of the early days when Redemption Creek was nothing more than a water stop for weary travelers, while Montgomery shared his vision for the railroad's role in connecting isolated communities across the Southwest. Thomas always sat at their table, honored as the man whose compassion had made their reunion possible. During quiet moments, Eleanor would sometimes confide in Thomas about her amazement at how her life had changed. She had spent so many years accepting poverty and loneliness as her permanent condition, never daring to hope that her circumstances could improve. The transformation from destitute widow to beloved mother of the territory's most influential citizen felt like a dream from which she might still wake. Montgomery's business empire continued to grow, but his priorities had fundamentally shifted. Rather than pursuing profits at any cost, he focused on sustainable development that would benefit entire communities over the long term. His mother's influence led him to establish schools, hospitals, and civic improvements wherever his railroad lines extended. These investments created loyalty and cooperation that proved more valuable than the fear and resentment his earlier methods had generated. Thomas found himself increasingly involved in Montgomery's philanthropic efforts, using his carpentry skills to build structures that would serve communities for generations. He constructed schoolhouses in remote settlements, repaired churches damaged by harsh weather, and built homes for families displaced by economic hardship. Each project carried forward the spirit of generosity that had begun with Eleanor's roof repair. The story of Thomas, Eleanor, and Montgomery became something of a legend throughout Arizona Territory and beyond. Travelers would stop in Redemption Creek hoping to meet the carpenter whose kindness had changed a railroad baron's heart, or to see the house where the miraculous reunion had taken place. Eleanor's home on Cottonwood Lane, now beautifully maintained and expanded, became an unofficial landmark for visitors to the region. Years passed, and Eleanor's health began to decline, as was natural for a woman who had endured decades of frontier hardship. Montgomery spent increasing amounts of time at her bedside, treasuring every conversation and memory they could share. Thomas often joined these visits, and the three of them would sit together in Eleanor's garden, watching the sun set over the mountains and reflecting on the mysterious ways that fate had brought them together. When Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, both Montgomery and Thomas were at her side. Her funeral drew mourners from across the territory, including Native American leaders, Mexican settlers, cattle ranchers, and railroad workers. The diversity of attendees reflected the bridges she had built between different communities through her son's transformed business practices and her own generous spirit. Montgomery inherited his mother's simple wooden toy train, which he kept in his office as a reminder of the love that had shaped his character and guided his decisions. He established the Eleanor Montgomery Foundation, dedicated to providing assistance to widows, orphans, and struggling families throughout the Southwest. Thomas became the foundation's chief administrator, ensuring that Eleanor's compassionate legacy would continue indefinitely. In the end, Thomas's spontaneous decision to repair a stranger's roof had created ripple effects that transformed not just individual lives, but entire communities across the American frontier. The carpenter's tools that had once seemed so modest became instruments of profound social change, proving that acts of simple human kindness possess power beyond anything wealth or position could achieve. Montgomery's railroad empire eventually spanned multiple states, but he always credited his greatest success to the day a poor carpenter chose compassion over convenience and set in motion the events that brought him home to his mother's love. The legacy of that autumn afternoon in Redemption Creek lived on in the countless families who benefited from improved working conditions, the children who received educations in schools built with railroad money, and the communities that flourished because one man chose to see suffering and respond with generosity instead of indifference. Thomas Hartwell's name might not appear in history books alongside the great railroad barons and territorial governors, but his influence on the development of the American Southwest was immeasurable, flowing from a single moment when he decided that repairing a widow's roof mattered more than protecting his own security.